Today, we're taking a close look at a really fascinating moment in American history.
Yeah, the U.S. presidential election of 1920. 100 years on, it still tells us a lot.
It really does. And we've got some great material here, some excerpts that really paint a vivid picture of the time.
So our mission, basically, is to unpack what went down, why it was so significant, using these sources.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. What's happening in America, in the world, around 1920?
Well, first off, you're just coming out of World War I. I mean, the sheer scale of that conflict had shaken everything up globally and domestically.
And right after the war, you get hit with the Spanish flu pandemic, just devastating.
Absolutely devastating. Millions died worldwide. It left this deep scar on society.
Plus, you've got Prohibition literally about to kick in. The 18th Amendment had just been ratified. Alcohol's becoming illegal nationwide.
So yeah, it's a time of massive upheaval, socially, economically, politically. The ground felt like it was shifting under everyone's feet.
The materials really bring that out, this feeling of a country at a crossroads, kind of wondering, okay, what now? Who are we after all that intensity?
Exactly. And you have to look at who was leading up to this. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, had been president for 8 years.
A major figure, led the country through the war, had his 14 points, really championed the League of Nations, an idealist.
Very much an idealist, a progressive, a powerful presence. But by 1920, the mood in the country,
Yeah.
well, it had changed dramatically.
Yeah, the sources describe this weariness. People were tired of war, tired of these grand, idealistic crusades.
Tired of the constant calls for sacrifice, maybe. They were just ready for something different, a breather.
A real sense of fatigue with that kind of high-minded interventionist style Wilson represented. They wanted a change.
Which leads us right into the election itself and the choices voters had. Let's talk Republicans first.
Okay, so it wasn't immediately obvious who their nominee would be, right? The material mentions some early frontrunners.
Yeah, people like Leonard Wood, a general, and Frank Loudon, the governor of Illinois. They were seen as strong contenders going into the convention.
But then, out of a sort of deadlock convention comes this dark horse.
Warren G. Harding, a senator from Ohio. Not exactly the name on everyone's lips beforehand.
And the sources really emphasize how different he was from Wilson. Not intellectual or intense.
No, the descriptions are more like genial, easygoing, approachable, someone you could imagine having a relaxed chat with.
And his core message, the phrase everyone remembers, was this call for a return to
Normalcy.
normalcy. And it's funny, the excerpts point out that grammatically it wasn't even really a standard word back then.
Nope, purists probably winced. But it did matter. It resonated deeply. It captured what people were feeling.
It wasn't about going back exactly, but finding some kind of equilibrium, a rest.
I think that's right. A new stability after years of turmoil. And his running mate, Calvin Coolidge.
Yes. Former governor of Massachusetts. Known for breaking the Boston police strike. A different kind of appeal, maybe. Quiet strength.
Definitely played into that image. So that's the Republican offering. Harding, Coolidge, and normalcy.
Okay, so what about the Democrats? They're facing this mood, Wilson's fading popularity, his health issues. That sounds like a tough spot.
A very steep challenge. They nominated James M. Cox, who was also, interestingly, the governor of Ohio.
An all-Ohio race for the White House.
Pretty much. And Cox's running mate, this is a detail that really jumps out when you read the material.
I know which one you mean.
A young, charismatic assistant secretary of the Navy named Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Yes, that Franklin D. Roosevelt, seeing his name there so early on is just a fantastic historical nugget from these sources.
It really is. So Cox and FDR, their strategy, according to the texts, was largely to defend Wilson's record.
Especially the League of Nations, trying to carry that torch.
Exactly. They tried to make the case for Wilsonian internationalism, but, well, given the public mood we discussed.
It sounds like swimming upstream. A really tough sell in 1920.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the big issues dividing people. And the League of Nations was arguably number one.
Wilson saw it as the only way to prevent another world war. His legacy project.
But the opposition, especially powerful Republicans, were deeply suspicious. They saw it as getting dragged into Europe's problems forever.
Losing control over American foreign policy, basically. That was the fear.
Right. And Hardy's position on this, as the material describes it, was, well, it was clever politics, perhaps. A bit ambiguous.
So.
He mostly opposed the League as Wilson proposed it, but he didn't slam the door entirely on any kind of international association. He kept it vague enough.
So he could appeal to the strong isolationists, but maybe not alienate all the internationalists,
Yeah,
walking a fine line.
precisely. It allowed him to capture that anti-League sentiment without looking like a complete hermit on the world stage.
Okay, besides the League, what else was top of mind? The economy must have been a factor.
Huge factor. There had been a post-war boom, but by 1920, things were turning sour. A recession was setting in,
And who gets the blame when the economy tanks?
usually the party in power.
Yeah.
So the Democrats were definitely feeling the heat on that front.
The sources also mention labor unrest being a big deal, lots of strikes.
Yes, major strikes were happening. It was a period of significant labor tension, and that worried a lot of people, adding to the sense of instability.
And then there's prohibition looming over everything. Maybe not the central campaign issue, but you can't ignore it.
Definitely not. The whole country was about to embark on this massive social experiment. It was part of that backdrop of huge change.
Okay, now let's talk about something truly groundbreaking that the material highlights. Something that changed the electorate itself.
You mean the women's vote?
Exactly, the 19th Amendment, ratified just months before the election.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around the impact. Suddenly, millions and millions of women across the entire country could vote in a presidential election for the very first time.
Millions. And the sources really stressed this. Nobody knew how they would vote. It was the great unknown.
Would they vote as a bloc? Would they vote like their husbands or fathers? Would they favor one party over the other? It added this huge layer of unpredictability.
A fascinating element, reading about it now. So all these factors are swirling around. Election day arrives, November 2nd, 1920.
Yep, the moment of truth.
Was it nail-biter? Did Cox make it close despite the headwinds?
Not even remotely close. The results were just decisive. It showed how much that normalcy message had landed.
So Harding won.
Won in an absolute historic landslide. The numbers cited are really stark. Over 60% of the popular vote.
60%, that's massive.
It was the largest popular vote percentage victory up to that point in American history. He just crushed Cox in the Electoral College, too.
Where did Cox even win?
Basically, only the states of the traditional Solid South, which reliably voted Democrat back then. Everywhere else, pretty much Harding territory.
Wow. So why? Going back to the sources, what do they tell us about why normalcy was such a winning formula? What did it tap into?
I think the materials really connect it back to that weariness we talked about. The war, the pandemic, the intense pace of reforms under Wilson. People were just emotionally and psychologically spent.
They wanted a break from the drama.
Exactly. Harding's promise, even if it was vague, offered comfort. It signaled less government intervention, less focus on global problems, maybe more focus on everyday life and business at home. It felt like permission to relax.
A collective exhale, maybe?
That's a good way to put it. A national exhale. They weren't necessarily rejecting progress forever, but they wanted to pause. They wanted things to feel stable again.
So the election itself, the material makes clear, was more than just choosing a president. It was a statement.
A very clear statement. A repudiation of Wilsonian idealism and internationalism. It marked this decisive pivot.
Towards what?
Towards conservatism, towards a more inward-looking, isolationist stance in foreign policy, at least for a while. It really set the tone for the entire decade to come.
The Roaring Twenties, which we remember for, jazz,
Yeah.
flappers, economic boom.
All that, yes. But also, as the material notes indirectly by mentioning Harding, it was a decade that would see its share of scandal, particularly after Harding's death in office in 1923.
Right, the Teapot Dome scandal really tarnished his administration's legacy later on.
It did. But the election itself, the choice made in 1920, was the pivotal moment. That's what shaped the initial direction of the decade, despite what came later.
So if we boil it down, what's the main lesson you take from these sources about the 1920 election? What's the big takeaway?
For me, it's a powerful reminder that history doesn't move in a straight line. Progress, or whatever you want to call it, isn't always forward motion.
Sometimes the pendulum swings back.
It really does. After periods of intense change or upheaval or ambitious reform, there can be this strong pull towards, well, normalcy, towards stability, familiarity, maybe even conservatism. People want to catch their breath.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Looking at our own complex world today.
Absolutely. It leaves you with a question to chew on. When things feel particularly chaotic or uncertain, how powerful is that desire for stability, for a return to something perceived as normal? What does that 1920 swing tell us about what electorates might look for today?
Something for all of us to consider.